All right, so hello everybody. As I said in the post, I'm going to go ahead and do my comments on the readings just via lecture video recording, because I tried to do it in the Collaborate today and there's so many issues, and I don't want someone to miss out on the information that I'm giving you for the lectures, for the readings, because, of connection issues. So from this point on, each week when I assign the readings, I'll also give you a breakdown of some key ideas that you should be taking from them, so that when we get, or when you get to the quiz and discussion boards, and ultimately the final project that I'll talk about next week, you have information that you can use to put into your own words for the assignments that you'll need to write. So I'm going to start out with James Whitfield, and I'm basically going to just go through chronological order the readings from last week and flow right into the Harlem Renaissance. And I'll probably do 2 to 3 videos because, as I said, or as I've been saying, loading it is just easier if I do break it up into separate videos instead of one large video. All right, so I'm going to start with James Whitfield's America. And Whitfield is a writer that basically bridges the Great Migration with the Harlem Renaissance. So he is a writer that is writing as Black Americans are transitioning out of slavery and going into what we would call modernity or modern times. And so we have Whitfield doing a great job of giving commentary on what it means to be Black in America. And we know from a historical perspective that this question will be asked throughout history, particularly once we get into the 1900s onward and Black Americans begin to shape their lives, their sense of identity, purpose, culture, essentially who they become as members of American society. And so James Whitfield, if you look at the introduction in the anthology textbook, was a contemporary or late contemporary of Frederick Douglass, and also endorsed by Williams Wells Brown. And so he was a poet that has some really interesting works. He kind of reminds me of David Walker. If you remember, we talked about David Walker's appeals in his preamble, and Walker was very kind of overt in his discussion of how America was hypocritical, how it contradicted itself as a nation that's supposed to be under God and yet keeps slaves and brutalizes them. And so I assigned Whitfield's America, and that poem really kind of speaks to what Walker was also getting at in his work, which is how powerful it is to consider yourself a free, liberal nation and yet keep slaves. Are you done?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. All right. So if we look at the first stanza of America, this is on page 423 for those that are in the textbook. It says, "America, it is to thee, thou boasted land of liberty. It is to thee I raise my song, thou land of blood and crime and wrong. It is to thee, my native land, from whence hath issued many a band, to tear the black man from his soil, and force him here to delve and toil. Change on your blood be moistened sod, cringing beneath a tyrant's rod." And in this passage, this stanza, it's so beautiful because Whitfield brings out the contradictory nature of the nation. We all know those wonderful patriotic songs like "My Country 'Tis of Thee," the Star Spangled Banner, that talk about the liberty and freedom that is supposed to represent the United States or America. And yet Whitfield is asking, okay, you're a land of liberty, and yet you're a land of blood and crime and wrong. And so the poem is really interesting because it continues to bring out just how much there is a contradiction between what America espouses and what it actually is. And he talks about the experiences of Black men in particular. If you look at the stanzas 100 on page 425, "And manhood too, with soul of fire, and arm of strength and smothered ire, stands pondering with brow of gloom upon his dark unhappy doom, whether to plunge in battle's strife, and buy his freedom with his life, and with stout heart and weapon strong, pay back the tyrant wrong for wrong, or wait the promised time of God, when his almighty ire shall wake, and smite the oppressor in his wrath, and hurl ruin in his path. So here you see Whitfield asking, if you are a person of faith as a Black American, do you take up arms against your oppressor, or do you rely on the ideology that we find in Christianity that eventually people will get what's due to them, that they will reap the consequences of their negative and immoral behavior? And so Whitfield is bringing out just how Black people, Black Americans, grapple with this tension. How do you exist in a space and live and find peace in an element where you are not meant to have peace? And remember what I said, I think in our last lecture just before spring break, the interesting thing about Black Americans and their development in this country is that we are a people with no home. Essentially, we are taken from Africa, and Africa continues to exist after we leave in the West African countries that we are taken from. And then Black Americans arrive in America as chattel slaves. Right? So they are not welcome citizens. They do not find themselves in a place where they can find acceptance and rest and all those things that we essentially associate with home. We are a people without a home. And so here we see Whitfield asking, what should we do in this circumstance? What are our options? Do we take up our weapon? Do we pay back the tyrant wrong for wrong, or wait the promised time of God? And Whitfield allows us to consider and ponder those questions. What is the right thing to do? He then goes on to talk about the spiritualism in stanza 140. We do not come before thy throne with carnal weapons drenched in gore, although our blood has freely flown, in addition to the tyrant's store. Father, before thy throne we come, not in the panoply of war, with pealing trump and rolling drum. So he says we are coming to our Heavenly Father, again referencing this idea of supplicating our Christian God, and yet we come with an attitude that is not violence for violence. And we'll later see as we enter into the civil rights movement that everyone does not espouse that ideology, that we should resist without violence, that passive resistance is best. And so here, even, 100 years before we get to civil rights, you see Whitfield in this poem grappling with what is the appropriate response. And thus far, from his perspective, Black Americans have essentially come with a spiritual kind of reckoning, with a sense of arguing their rights and their humanity and their ability to exist as human beings because of what the scriptures say, because of who they are as children of God. And again, that's something that Walker also espouses, yet he also says, much like we'll see later with Malcolm X, by any means necessary. Black people, we have to do something because our condition of slavery is not something that we can accept. So that's one of the reasons why I love Whitfield, because his poetry is so rapturous and beautiful. And yet at the same time, he's kind of talking about these really kind of weighty and heavy issues that Black Americans are facing. Okay, so we'll keep going now to Frances Harper. And Frances Harper, like Whitfield, is another writer who was known, as I said, at the latter half of the 1800s. She transitions into writers that we'll see in the early 1900s, and she lives not to the Harlem Renaissance, about a decade before she passes. But she's a Black American writer who also does a great job of writing not only some collections of poems, but also what we might call novellas or short stories, not quite huge sweeping novels, but at the same time, wonderful works of fiction. One of her most famous is Iola Leroy. If I had time, I would assign that, because to me, it's one of the greatest earlier African-American novels. And she also incorporates in her works the tragic mulatto figure. If you remember from the slavery and freedom period, we talked a little bit about the tragic mulatto as a character who is stuck in a condition because she is both black and white, and has to grapple with how pure they are as black people because they are essentially of a mixed race. And so she published about 5 collections of poetry. One of the poems that I assigned was Learning to Read. And if you remember, I talked about the mass literacy movement that we see at the turn of the 19th century. With Black Americans who are no longer in slavery. And so now there is a mass movement to see literacy happen, to make sure that Black Americans can read and write, fostered largely by the African American church. And so the Black church really functions as one of the core systems for schooling and education in most Black communities in the country during that time. And so, as I said, you know, over the course of one generation, we see Black Americans ultimately go from becoming completely illiterate to almost, almost totally literate to a certain extent. So being able to read and write up to a certain degree of elementary education. And so that's powerful to think that there was such a recognition among Black Americans during this time that reading and writing was critical to being able to navigate in American society at the turn of the century. So her poem, Learning to Read, I think is a beautiful, beautiful poem that talks about the significance of learning to read. And I won't read everything, but I will read 2 of my favorite stanzas. Our masters always tried to hide book learning from our eyes. Knowledge didn't agree with slavery. 'Twould make us all too wise. But some of us would try to steal a little from the book and put the words together and learn by hook or crook. And so it's amazing that Harper is bringing out just the power of literacy to change the lives of Black people, and how slave masters were very intentional in forbidding the ability to read and write, because they knew that if slaves learned to read and write, then they would also gain access to power and the ability to essentially free themselves.